Politicians. No one likes them, and with good reason. They're selfish, dishonest, and opportunistic people. They'll tell you what you want to hear, regardless of whether or not they believe what they're saying is right. Regardless of what kind of political ideology you subscribe to, I'm sure you'd agree with what I've said so far. I'm going to get slightly more controversial by giving a specific example of a very popular politician who's guilty of some of the things I've described. Here's a video of Barack Obama opposing gay marriage during his 2008 presidential campaign.
With respect to gay marriage, I do not support gay marriage, but I support a very strong version of civil unions where I think the state has to recognize the same rights and responsibilities for gay people, same-sex couples, as they do for anybody else.
Here's another video of Barack Obama supporting gay marriage during his 2012 re-election campaign.
For me personally, it is important for me to go ahead and affirm that I think same-sex couples should be able to get married.
What happened in the intervening 4 years? Did his views evolve with age as they do for all of us? That's possible, but I'd also like to show you this chart from Pew Research Center. In 2008, more Americans opposed gay marriage than supported it. In 2012, it was the opposite. 48% were in favor, and 43% were opposed. Support for gay marriage in the United States didn't exceed 50% until 2014. I don't know what was happening in Obama's head, but I do know for a fact that his position on the issue never contradicted popular opinion. This kind of thing happens all the time in politics. But there are a few examples where politicians take the risk of expressing their honest opinions even when doing so is politically inconvenient. Here's one famous example of a politician giving a decent answer to an unfairly framed question. Just to give you a heads up, this video will cover some dark topics including violence, rape, murder, and slavery. Here's your chance to check out.
The first question goes to Governor Dukakis. You have 2 minutes to respond. Governor, if Kitty Dukakis were raped and murdered, would you favor an irrevocable death penalty for the killer?
No, I don't, Bernard, and I think you know that I've opposed the death penalty during all of my life. I don't see any evidence that it's a deterrent, and I think there are better and more effective ways to deal with violent crime. We've done so in my own state, and it's one of the reasons why we have had the biggest drop in crime of any industrial state in America, why we have the lowest murder rate of any industrial state in America.
That's Michael Dukakis answering Bernard Shaw in a debate leading up to the 1988 presidential election. He stuck to his principles despite the fact that Shaw tried to bait Dukakis into delivering an emotional response that might have gotten Dukakis to contradict himself. I call this a decent rather than a great answer because while he's right to oppose the death penalty, he failed to acknowledge the ridiculousness of how the question was framed. The death penalty is a barbaric punishment for any criminal. Invoking the image of the candidate's wife being raped and murdered is a cheap tactic to get Dukakis to make an exception on the human right to life. As unfair as this strategy might be, it's certainly effective. I'll get more into this later. Voters didn't like Dukakis' rational, dispassionate response, but that says a lot more about how framing can warp our perception of important issues than the quality of Dukakis' answer.
It can be frustrating to some who think, how can a debate turn on that? But it fed into a narrative fairly or unfairly for Michael Dukakis that he was too much of a technocrat.
Governor.
Some debate moments are less about the substance and more about the passion or lack thereof in an answer. And nothing to me jumps out more than what happened with Governor Michael Dukakis in '88. Governor Dukakis answered the substance of the question, not referencing at all the fact that his wife was used as the example in the question, and instead talked about the issue itself, the death. But it came across to some, perhaps as robotic, or that it was that he totally seemed to not be nonplussed by the idea. Voters choose him for very different reasons. Some people are all about the book smarts. Some people want to gut character. Some people just look at it and say, does this person represent everything that America is, or that America should be in some form or another? So there's always a different reason why people vote for certain people and why they discount certain issues. But that was a moment that was a reminder that many voters aren't looking for an answer. They're looking for a gut check for whatever that is, and Michael Dukakis failed a gut check for enough voters in that moment.
Here's another more recent example of a decent answer to a question posed to a presidential candidate despite poor framing. It's also the main topic of this video.
Senator Sanders, you have said that you believe that people with felony records should be allowed to vote while in prison. Does this mean that you would support enfranchising people like the Boston Marathon bomber, a convicted terrorist and murderer? Do you think that those convicted of sexual assault should have the opportunity to vote for politicians who could have a direct impact on women's rights?
I think the right to vote is inherent to our democracy. Yes, even for terrible people.
As someone who believes electoral politics are an important but insufficient means for building a better world, I have serious problems with the senator's stance on a number of issues, despite believing he's the best candidate in the field as of this recording. I still have to respect the answer he gave here. I've only included the portion of the response that CNN included in their discussion after the debate, but I'll link a longer video from Now This News in the description. Sanders did a risky thing here. His home state of Vermont is one of only 2 in the country, the other being Maine, that allow people to vote while they're in prison. In a YouGov poll conducted shortly after the question was posed to Sanders, American adults were asked how they feel about the statement, all prisoners, including terrible people like the Boston Marathon bomber, should be allowed to vote. 65% disagreed somewhat or strongly. Maybe you're in that 65%. If so, then welcome. This video is for you. I believe you're a decent person, and I think you can be convinced it's essential for all prisoners, including terrible people like the Boston Marathon bomber, rapists, and murderers, to be allowed to vote. I've gone and compiled the best arguments I could find against allowing prisoners to vote, and will present some even stronger arguments in favor of allowing prisoners to vote. Then I'll give some historical context to explain how we even got to a point where most prisoners can't vote. As bizarre as it may seem to most Americans, the idea of letting prisoners vote really isn't radical at all. Let's begin. Argument 1. Prisoners shouldn't be able to vote because they broke the law. Banning them from voting should be part of their punishment. This might be the most common of all the reasons I've come across. Here's a clip of Greg Gutfield from the Fox News talk show, The Five.
These candidates also miss the point of incarceration. Now, if you're just joining us from CNN, this may shock you, but when you're in prison, you lose rights. It's called prison, not spring break. So no, it's not a slippery slope when denying voting rights, because the slope doesn't actually exist. You're in jail. There is no freedom. You can't even vote with your feet.
I'll also quote 2 specific articles for the purposes of this video. In the National Review, Roger Clegg and Hans A. von Spakovsky co-author "There Are Good Reasons for Felons to Lose the Right to Vote," in response to fellow conservative George Will's surprising stance against felon disenfranchisement. Clegg and von Spakovsky say this: if you're not willing to follow the law, then you should not have a role in making the law for everyone else, which is what you do when you vote, either directly in the case of a referendum or ballot initiative, or indirectly by choosing lawmakers and law enforcers. I should also point out that these 2 make an even more extreme argument than the people on the Fox News segment I played. Clegg and von Spakovsky don't even support automatically restoring voting rights to people after they leave prison. In another National Review article, published after Sanders spoke at the town hall, John R. Lott Jr. said, "Criminals shouldn't cast deciding votes that overrule the policy preferences of law-abiding Americans." A point I'm going to have to repeat many times in this and future videos is that incarceration has very little to do with justice or with turning criminals into better people. Just like race and gender, crime is a social construct. People decide whether an act is legal or illegal. Nothing is inherently criminal. There's a social purpose behind all of it. In the context of the present-day United States, one of the main purposes is to keep the public focused on and afraid of members of the working class, rather than on the system of economic exploitation that leads to crime. This may come as a surprise to many viewers because this contradicts everything we've been told about prisons, but it's the truth. Prisons are a way for rich, powerful people to disappear those they deem undesirable. Rich people have a disproportionately large influence over which laws are passed, so naturally, they enact laws that help them maintain their power and wealth at the expense of poor people. Here's an example of what I mean. In 2017, There was a viral news item about a couple who was arrested for stealing baby formula from a pick and save supermarket in Wisconsin. If you ask 100 people whether or not stealing is wrong, I'm sure most of them would say yes. It's not hard to guess why. You're probably familiar with the golden rule: treat others the way you like to be treated. People know they wouldn't like their possessions taken from them without their permission, and they apply that principle to others. Therefore, stealing is wrong because it's taking away a person's possessions without their permission. However, in the case of these arrests, the couple didn't steal anything from a person. They stole from a corporation, and regardless of what the United States Supreme Court says, corporations are not people. They exist to generate profit for their owners at the expense of their employees, the general public, and the environment. People don't have that same inherent need for profit. The kind of person who would shoplift is unlikely to have shares in a publicly traded company. They're more likely to be lower class and be driven to petty crime out of necessity. Capitalism perverts human existence into a ruthless competition over artificially scarce resources for the benefit of corporations. Let's take a look at the corporation at the heart of this news story. The couple was arrested after leaving a pick and save. Pick and Save is owned by Roundy's, which itself is owned by Kroger, one of the world's largest retailers worth billions of dollars. They could survive one or 100 burglaries, but it gets even worse. In 2013, a report by the environmental group Greenpeace called Carting Away the Ocean 7 found that Kroger stocked 17 of 22 fish on their red list. What does it mean to be on Greenpeace's red list? I'll let them describe it. The Greenpeace Seafood Red List for the United States includes 22 different species due to concerns such as poor stock health, bycatch issues, and habitat destruction. Additionally, certain species, such as orange roughy, hoki, and shark, are considered to be more problematic than others due to intrinsic challenges such as physiology, life history, and key ecosystem services. Greenpeace profiled 20 retailers that year, and Kroger ranked in at 18. Here's what Greenpeace had to say. What a disgrace. For the second year in a row, Kroger takes the cake for being the worst performer in the red list category. As I mentioned before, Kroger was selling 17 of 22 red listed fish. They were also selling parrotfish, which weren't on the red list, but is still a serious problem. Greenpeace explains why. Fragile coral reef ecosystems depend upon parrotfish to help keep algae from overgrowing corals. Parrotfish could easily have been designated a red list species when Cato was launched, only it seemed unthinkable that any major US retailer would sell the species to any significant degree. Apparently, when it comes to Kroger, even the unthinkable is likely. So we have significant ecological damage being caused by the same company that set police on a working class couple for shoplifting. But maybe that doesn't bother you. And to be fair to Kroger, they have noticeably improved since this report was released. In 2018, Greenpeace released another report called Carting Away the Ocean's 10. This time, Kroger climbed all the way up to 11th place out of 22 retailers ranked. Greenpeace said the following. After years of lackluster performance, Kroger improved significantly in this year's assessment. The retailer performed best in the policies and initiatives categories, making progress on the sustainable seafood goals and using its brand and buying power to advocate for fisheries reforms ranging from the global tuna industry to domestic fisheries. Kroger has gotten better in this area, but unfortunately, the fishing industry as a whole has a dark secret that I'm sure would make everyone's stomach churn, not just tree huggers. It wouldn't be possible to find seafood at your local supermarket at low prices without the help of slave labor. I'll link the 2015 Associated Press investigation on slavery in the seafood industry in this video's description. Hundreds of workers, including children, are trafficked from Myanmar through Thailand to Indonesia. They are lied to about future payment and given fake travel documents. Many of them land in Benjina, where they are literally locked in cages. They eat no more than a small amount of rice and curry. Some of them have been abandoned by the people who captured them and have no hope of ever returning home. AP reports, just off a beach covered in sharp coral, a graveyard swallowed by the jungle entombs dozens of fishermen. They are buried under fake Thai names given to them when they were tricked or sold onto their ships, forever covering up evidence of their captors' abuse, their friends say. Those who make it off Benjina don't fare much better. Due to overfishing, ships have to travel farther and farther away from shorelines to catch a decent haul of fish. Precious time would be wasted if large ships docked and undocked regularly. Vessels instead use a process called transshipment, where large ships stay in the ocean while smaller ships deliver them fuel and move the fish back to shore. For enslaved workers, this means being trapped in the ocean for months or years in some cases. Here's what they had to say about their conditions. They said the captors on their fishing boats forced them to drink unclean water and work 20 to 22-hour shifts with no days off. Almost all said they were kicked, whipped with toxic stingray tails, or otherwise beaten if they complained or tried to rest. They were paid little or nothing, as they hauled in heavy nets with squid, shrimp, snapper, grouper, and other fish. Some fishermen were so depressed that they simply threw themselves into the water. Wynn, 40, said his most painful task was working without proper clothing in the ship's giant freezer, where temperatures dropped to 39 degrees below zero. The supermarkets that sell these fish know all about the slavery. The police know too, and unsurprisingly, they haven't jailed any of the American executives who buy from ships that use slave labor. Here's a quote from Greenpeace's 2015 report. In December 2014, Interpol, an intergovernmental organization facilitating international police cooperation, held a special session on human rights abuses at sea during its annual conference on human trafficking. Despite being invited, no industry representatives attended. Think about it for a second. They were invited, despite the fact that police knew these companies were profiting from slavery. The police didn't arrest them despite knowing what they were guilty of. If a cop did decide to go after these executives, then the industry could use their wealth to hire the best legal defense in the country. Rich people also tend to be very well connected with government officials who have the power to ruin a cop's career if the officer steps out of line. Before I get back to the voting issue, I want to stress that this example wasn't hard to find. This isn't just a Kroger problem or a fishing industry problem, it's a capitalism problem. Horrific practices like this take place in every industry. There are millions of enslaved people worldwide. Choose any major corporation and take a close look at their supply chain. You're guaranteed to find things like forced labor and ecological destruction. It's not possible to be able to walk into a store and buy products made thousands of miles away at a low price without this kind of abuse. So to recap, under our system, stealing baby formula means you don't deserve the right to vote. Profiting off of slavery though, A-OK. Now, according to the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, retailers are supposed to do something about human rights abuses in their supply chain. Where a business enterprise causes or may cause an adverse human rights impact, it should take the necessary steps to seize or prevent the impact. Where a business enterprise contributes or may contribute to an adverse human rights impact, it should take the necessary steps to seize or prevent its contribution and use its leverage to mitigate any remaining impact to the greatest extent possible. Leverage is considered to exist where the enterprise has the ability to effect change in the wrongful practices of an entity that causes the harm. However, these are just guidelines. They are neither strict international laws nor United States laws, at least as far as I can tell. You're welcome to correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. No American executive has been legally punished for this. They can all still vote despite being responsible for acts far worse than shoplifting.
These candidates also miss the point of incarceration. Now, if you're just joining us from CNN, this may shock you, but when you're in prison, you lose rights. It's called prison, not spring break.
I hope by now I've proven to you that it's Fox News and not Sanders who misses the point of incarceration. The point is to protect the financial interests of the capitalist class. Allowing prisoners to vote is a small way to give the working class some of the power they need to finally be treated fairly. What about Clegg and von Spakovsky's argument? If you're not willing to follow the law, then you should not have a role in making law for everyone else, which is what you do when you vote. Well, to them I say, criminals already have major roles in lawmaking. You don't even have to look particularly far back in American history. In 2003, President George W. Bush plunged Iraq into a devastating war lasting nearly a decade. Conservative estimates put the number of casualties well over 100,000. The invasion was in violation of Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter. I wouldn't be the first person to point out that if prisoners were allowed to vote, Bush never would have been elected. I'll have Angela Davis explain.
That it can confidently be argued that the Bush presidency was precisely enabled by the relegation of a large majority black population of free individuals to the status of civil death. Most of you know the story of the Florida elections, and you are aware of the fact that not only were former prisoners removed from the voting rolls, but also those who were suspected of being felons.
For more of her thoughts on the relationship between prisons and democracy, I strongly recommend her book, Abolition Democracy. If that clip wasn't enough to sway you, here's Emmett Sanders, no relation to the senator by the way, in the People's Policy Project article, Full Human Beings. Christopher Eugen and Jeff Monza emphasize that if people with felony convictions had been allowed to vote in the 2000 Florida general election, the state that Bush won over Gore by just over 500 votes, Gore would have handily won and secured the presidency. With roughly 70,000 people disenfranchised in Florida prisons at that time, the same argument could be made for just the incarcerated vote alone. Of course, Bush wasn't the only criminal president. After he left office, Obama took over his predecessor's drone program and ramped up the bombing significantly. The official number of civilians killed is in the hundreds, but the actual number is likely in the thousands due to the administration's broad definition of enemy. The process often depends on assumptions or best guesses in provinces like Hunar or Nuristan, the source said, particularly if the dead include military-age males, or MAMs, in military parlance. If there is no evidence that proves a person killed in a strike was either not a MAM or was a MAM, but not an unlawful enemy combatant, he said, they label them enemy killed in action. In the case of airstrikes in a campaign like Haymaker, the source added, missiles could be fired from a variety of aircraft, but 9 out of 10 times it's a drone strike. So that's two former presidents who together killed thousands of innocent people and will never see a day in prison. They've never even been put on trial. You know who else hasn't been given a trial? More than 90% of prisoners. Decades of police procedurals have given the public a mistaken idea of what happens after a person gets arrested. People believe that if someone is in prison, then their guilt must have been fairly determined by a jury of their peers. The reality is much grimmer. The rise of mandatory minimums and sentencing guidelines has given prosecutors an extremely unfair advantage over the defense to the point where defendants are better off pleading guilty than attempting to make their case in court. Judge Jed S. Rakoff explains how this works in detail in the November 20th, 2014 issue of the New York Review of Books. In an article titled, Why Innocent People Plead Guilty, he states, while the 1950s were a period of relatively low crime rates in the U.S., rates began to rise substantially in the 1960s, and by 1980 or so, serious crime in the U.S., much of it drug-related, was occurring at a frequency not seen for many decades. As a result, state and federal legislatures hugely increased the penalties for criminal violations. In New York, for example, the so-called Rockefeller laws, enacted in 1973, dictated a mandatory minimum sentence of 15 years imprisonment for selling just 2 ounces or possessing 4 ounces of heroin, cocaine, or marijuana. In addition, in response to what was perceived as a tendency of too many judges to impose too lenient sentences, the new enhanced sentences were frequently made mandatory, and in those 37 states where judges were elected, many soft judges were defeated, and tough-on-crime judges were elected in their place. In addition to mandatory minimums, Congress in 1984 introduced, with bipartisan support, a regime of mandatory sentencing guidelines designed to avoid irrational sentencing disparities. These guidelines, along with mandatory minimums, were causing the virtual extinction of jury trials in federal criminal cases. Thus, whereas in 1980, 19% of all federal defendants went to trial, by 2000, the number had decreased to less than 6%, and by 2010 to less than 3%, where it has remained ever since. So far, Rakoff has tracked the history of the declining percentage of defendants going to trial. It still doesn't explain why they're choosing not to. Sentencing guidelines and mandatory minimums just mean the punishments are tougher. Why wouldn't that make the accused want to go to court even more to escape absurd sentences? Here's where plea deals come in. Rakoff explains further. But what really puts a prosecutor in the driver's seat is the fact that he, because of mandatory minimums, sentencing guidelines, which, though no longer mandatory in the federal system, are still widely followed by most judges, and simply his ability to shape whatever charges are brought, can effectively dictate the sentence by how he publicly describes the offense. For example, the prosecutor can agree with the defense counsel in a federal narcotics case If there is a plea bargain, the defendant will only have to plead guilty to the personal sale of a few ounces of heroin, which carries no mandatory minimum and a guidelines range of less than 2 years. But if the defendant does not plead guilty, he will be charged with the drug conspiracy of which his sale was a small part, a conspiracy involving many kilograms of heroin, which could mean a 10-year mandatory minimum and a guidelines range of 20 years or more. Put another way, it is the prosecutor, not the judge, who effectively exercises the sentencing power, albeit cloaked as a charging decision. If you're working class and you don't have the money to hire a private lawyer, you might feel pressure to accept a plea deal, even if you know you're innocent. Sure, you technically have a right to a public defender, but as Richard A. Opple Jr. and Jugal K. Patel report in the New York Times, the average public defender has way more on their plate than they can realistically handle. It's very common for defendants to be advised to take a plea deal after just minutes of speaking to their lawyer. Some days the courtroom is so full that defendants overflow into an additional courtroom where there is no public defender. Those arrestees sometimes agree, without any legal advice, to plea deals that can have a profound impact on their lives. Naturally, this leads to thousands of innocent people behind bars and unable to vote for years, despite not being guilty of the crime they've been accused. Rakoff has some numbers on this. How prevalent is the phenomenon of innocent people pleading guilty? The few criminologists who have thus far investigated the phenomenon estimated that the overall rate for convicted felons as a whole is between 2 and 8%. The size of that range suggests the imperfection of the data, but let us suppose that it is even lower, say no more than 1%. When you recall that of the 2.2 million Americans in prison, over 2 million are there because of plea bargains, we are then talking about an estimated 20,000 persons or more who are in prison for crimes to which they pleaded guilty but did not in fact commit. Rakoff was using 2014 numbers. In 2019, there are about 1.6 million convicted people in prisons and jails across the United States. Rakoff's low estimate would still mean over 16,000 innocent people are incarcerated, most of whom cannot vote. In the mid-2000s, the number of innocent people in prison and unable to vote would have included former football player Brian Banks. He accepted a plea deal that required him to serve more than 5 years in prison after a rape accusation. In 2011, his accuser reached out to him over Facebook and admitted her story was made up.
We went there, we kissed, and we made out. We never had sex, but by the end of the day, I was being accused of sexual assault. There really was no evidence. In my situation, this girl had claimed that I sexually assaulted her, that there would be DNA found if they did DNA testing. There was no DNA. There was no physical evidence whatsoever in this case, as she said that there would be. There were no witnesses because we were in a secluded area that was a known makeout spot. I was facing 41 years to life at this time. Before I could get to trial, my lawyer pulled me into an interview room the day of jury selection at the courtroom building. And she sat me down with this huge grin on her face as I sat on the other side of the glass. And she began to tell me that she just came up with this amazing deal with the district attorney's office. Mind you, the first deal that they had offered me was 25 years in prison. The second deal was 18 years, and I believe the third deal was 9. And that deal was that if I pled no contest to one count of sexual assault, that I would undergo what's called a 90-day observation at Chino State Prison. But if you walk in there right now and you start selecting a jury, I can guarantee you that you're going to select a jury that's going to end up being an all-white jury, and they're going to find you guilty because you're a big black teenager. Those weren't my words. Those were my attorney's words that were spoken to me at the age of 17. Here I was by myself, 17 years old, and I'm sitting in this small, tiny room by myself, given 10 minutes to make this decision. Brian, this is the best option for you. You need to take this deal. And so I listened to her.
Okay, but that was an innocent man. Of course he doesn't deserve to have his right to vote taken away. What about actual rapists and actual murderers? They are horrible people. They shouldn't be allowed to vote, right? Argument 2. What about murderers and rapists?
This kind of invasion of woke thought, which is now really sending people nuts, I think is now being extended to areas like the penal system. And they're looking at this and saying, yeah, that makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense that rapists, pedophiles, terrorists, people guilty of treason, mass murderers, serial killers, they should all have the right to vote. That is the most important thing.
That you can absolutely distinguish violent crime convicts. And obviously, I think when you reduce it to that tiny little percentage of the serial rapists and that bombers, of course, absolutely not. But
I was honestly a little hesitant to include Brian Banks' story in my argument because I know some viewers are going to use it as a reason to discredit sexual assault survivors. A lot of people believe the myth that rape accusations are almost guaranteed to ruin the accused person's life. As horrible as false accusations are, it's statistically extremely rare for rape accusations to lead to a conviction. That even goes for cases where the accusation is completely true. According to Prison Policy Initiative, there are about 2,282,800 people in United States prisons, jails, and juvenile correctional facilities. 163,000, or about 7.1%, are locked up for rape or sexual assault. The Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, also known as RAINN, reports that only 23% of incidents of sexual assault are ever reported to police, and only 46 out of every 10,000 sexual assaults result in a conviction. A 2010 study by Northeastern University concluded that the false accusation rate for rape is between 2 and 10%. So while it's true that some people have been imprisoned due to false accusations, the number of these occurrences is orders of magnitude lower than the number of rapists whose crimes go unreported. All of this is a roundabout way of saying rapists are already voting and in some cases making laws. President Trump was accused of rape by his ex-wife Ivana Trump in a divorce deposition. As Brandy Zadrozny and Tim Mack of the Daily Beast report, the incident allegedly took place in 1989. Before the allegation was made public in Harry Hurt III's 1993 biography of Donald Trump, The Lost Tycoon, Donald and his lawyers arranged a meeting with the book's publisher where they delivered a statement from Ivana. The first page of the book says, "The statement by Ivana Trump does not contradict or invalidate any information contained in the book." Part of her statement reads, "I felt violated as the love and tenderness which he normally exhibited toward me was absent. I refer to this as rape, but I do not want my words to be interpreted in a literal or criminal sense." By this point, the couple had already been divorced and Ivana had won an estimated $25 million, which would be worth $45 million today, in their settlement. The terms of the divorce forbade her from speaking of their marriage without Donald's consent. Within a day of the publication of the Daily Beast 2015 article, CNN posted a statement from Ivana in which she says, "The story is totally without merit." As the Daily Beast is keen to point out, this means Ivana wasn't being truthful in her own divorce deposition. I'll let you be the judge of what really happened between them. If you conclude that Ivana's most recent statement is the most accurate one, then I'd also add that more than 20 other women have accused Donald Trump of a variety of acts of sexual misconduct, ranging from sexual harassment to rape. So rapists have been covered. What about murderers? Prison Policy Initiative puts the number of people in prison for murder and manslaughter at 197,000, or about 8.6% of all people locked up in the United States. I've already shown how easy it is for sitting presidents to get away with killing innocent people. They're still allowed to vote and govern from the country's most powerful office. If you're not the president, then the chances of you getting away with murder drop significantly. However, the odds don't fall below about 40%. Over at Vox, Herman Lopez wrote about the FBI's 2017 murder clearance rate. The agency revealed that nationwide, 61.6% of murder and non-negligent manslaughters were solved. A Washington Post investigation by Wesley Lowery, Kimberly O'Kelly, and Stephen Rich found that for black victims, there was only a 47% chance that anyone would even be arrested for the murder. I'm going to take a wild guess and say that the kind of person who would commit a murder probably isn't the most civically engaged. However, if such a person were an adult U.S. citizen and did decide to register and vote in the next election, there would be nothing stopping them as long as the authorities were unaware of their criminal history. The statistics I provided in this portion of the video only prove that our criminal punishment system isn't perfect at determining guilt. Some might say, why don't we just put those other bad people in prison so they lose their right to vote as well? So let's imagine for a second that we did have a system that could determine guilt with 100% accuracy. No innocent person ever ends up behind bars, and every guilty person serves their time. In such a scenario, would it be okay to take the right to vote away from all prisoners? The answer would still be no. For one thing, this doesn't fix the problem mentioned earlier, where acts more likely to be committed by poor people are more likely to be criminalized than behavior by rich people, even when the acts done by rich people are far more harmful. But I want to get a little more philosophical for a moment. Let's also assume that all of our laws were just. Even then, prisoners still deserve the right to vote. The signatories of the United States Declaration of Independence were not good people. Racism, sexism, slavery, they did it all and more. I'm not one to appeal to their authority, but I hope quoting this document will help sway viewers with more moderate views than my own. You're probably familiar with this part. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I'm going to set aside for a second the fact that they didn't actually believe everyone was created equally and focus on the following sentence. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Did you catch that part of the beginning? Governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Prisoners, no matter how awful the crimes they've committed have been, are still being governed. They should have a say in who's doing that governing. At Current Affairs, editor Nathan J. Robinson makes the same argument at length in his article, But Do You Want Dylann Roof to Have Rights? If we start asking about what about Dylann Roof, then any basic human entitlement will seem gross. Why should Dylann Roof get to stay in a soft bed? Why should he get state-funded medical care? Why should he even be allowed to live? If personal moral desert is a factor in these questions, then obviously someone like Roof deserves nothing at all because he's so reprehensible. But if we look at basic rights questions that way, then we will end up doing terrible things. Letting prisoners die because we refuse to give them adequate medical treatment, for instance. The crimes of people like Dylann Roof are so horrible that if we start using the seriousness of the crime of the measurement of how much humane treatment Roof deserved, he won't be treated humanely. Some people are completely fine with that, and do think that when someone commits an atrocity, it grants the rest of society a license to brutalize or even murder that person. Others of us, however, think nobody deserves that. As soon as you start making exceptions for human rights, you open the possibility of discrimination against those the state deems less than human. Under capitalism and white supremacy, this means working class people and people of color, especially black people. Until either system of domination is eradicated in the United States, any measure that allows the government to choose who rights are granted to will exclude the same sets of people. Argument 3. Prisoners shouldn't be able to vote because they choose Democrats.
I keep thinking that Bernie wants felons to vote because he knows they'll vote Democrat.
It is the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen. And the reason they're doing this, Juan, is because they can't persuade enough actual voters about their ideas, so they have to create new voters.
John R. Lott Jr. said this in National Review. If Democrats fight for and achieve felon disenfranchisement, they can count on having an even more loyal voting bloc. This is one of the weaker arguments against allowing prisoners to vote that I've found, but I'm including it because it's surprisingly common. If you're restricting people's right to vote based on how you think they'll vote, then there isn't really a right to vote. The same logic was used during Jim Crow to impose literacy tests as a means of disenfranchising black people. Here's an example from white supremacist South Carolina Senator and former Governor Pitchfork Ben Tillman. Throughout his political career, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, lynch mobs still regularly targeted black Americans. It's a tradition Tillman was proud of. After one such violent attack leading up to an election, a fellow senator asked Tillman how he felt about the murders. Tillman proceeded to blame his black constituents for their own deaths and said the following. I want to call the senator's attention to one fact. He said that the Republican Party gave the Negroes the ballot in order to protect themselves against the indignities and wrongs that were attempted to be heaped upon them by the enactment of the Black Code. I'm going to interject here to inform viewers that this quote is from the year 1900. This was decades before the Southern strategy, which flipped the party alignment to their current positions. Tillman was a Democrat back when Democrats were the conservatives and Republicans were the relatively progressive party. Tillman went on to say this. I want to ask the senator this proposition in arithmetic. In my state, there were 135,000 Negro voters, or Negroes of voting age, and some 90,000 or 95,000 white voters. General Canby set up a carpetbag government there and turned our state over to this majority. Now I want to ask you, with a free vote and a fair count, how are you going to beat 135,000 by 95,000? How are you going to do it? You had set us an impossible task. We did not disfranchise the Negroes until 1895. Then we had a constitutional convention convened which took the matter up calmly, deliberately, and avowedly with the purpose of disfranchising as many of them as we could under the 14th and 15th Amendment. We adopted this educational qualification as the only means left to us, and the Negro is as contented and as prosperous and as well protected in South Carolina today as in any state of the Union south of the Potomac. He is not meddling with politics, for he found that the more he meddled with them, the worse off he got. As to his rights, I will not discuss them now. We of the South have never recognized the right of the Negro to govern white men, and we never will. Tillman is making explicit what conservatives have learned to be implicit about. In 1900, the conservative line was, the 15th Amendment lets black people vote, which means we'll start losing elections. Let's add literacy tests to keep them from voting. From the passage of the Voting Rights Act to now, the message has morphed into, the Voting Rights Act banned us from using literacy tests to exclude black voters. Let's use prisons instead. As an aside, the literacy tests were complete hogwash for anyone unaware. Black people were given significantly harder tests than white people. In many cases, white people didn't have to take literacy tests at all. If anyone is using prisons to manipulate election results, it's Republicans. Just follow their own logic. If allowing prisoners to vote helps Democrats, then banning them from voting helps Republicans. If you're a Republican, why wouldn't you want to increase the amount of people in prison and take every measure possible to deprive prisoners of their civil rights? On Fox News of all places, one of their hosts, Emily Compagno, brings up one of the more subtle issues of banning prisoners from voting.
Why do we support, in essence, a prison-based gerrymandering when the people incarcerated are counted in that legislative district in which they are incarcerated?
It's a good question. States like building prisons in rural areas for two reasons. The first is that it keeps the imprisoned away from the general public. The further they are physically from the rest of society, the less likely it is the rest of us will do anything to help them. Every time you see a headline about abuse taking place in a prison, you should keep in mind that you're reading about events that probably aren't exceptional. The other reason for keeping prisons out of cities is to transfer electoral power from progressive urban areas to sparsely populated conservative rural areas. Prison Policy Initiative has a report on how this works. The Census Bureau counts incarcerated people as residents of the towns where they are confined, though they are barred from voting in 48 states and returned to their homes after being released. The practice also defies most state constitutions and statutes, which explicitly state that incarceration does not change our residence. The districts with large prisons get to send a representative to the state capitol to advocate for their interests without meeting the required number of residents. Because prisons are disproportionately built in rural areas, but most incarcerated people call urban areas home, counting prisoners in the wrong place results in a systemic transfer of population and political clout from urban to rural areas. 60% of Illinois prisoners are from Cook County, Chicago, yet 99% of them are counted outside the county. What's interesting about all this is that despite all the modern Republican Party's efforts to stifle progressive voters, Democrats still collectively get more votes, a lot more. But you wouldn't know that based on the makeup of Congress and the presidency. In 2016, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by well over 2 million. Unfortunately, due to the Electoral College, an undemocratic institution that dilutes the electoral influence of working-class voters of color, Donald Trump was declared the winner instead. After the 2018 midterm elections, Democrats had 47 Senate seats if you include the 2 independent senators who caucused with Democrats. Republicans had 53. A foreigner observing the election results might reasonably conclude that more Americans wanted a Republican-controlled Senate than a Democrat-controlled Senate. But of course, they'd be wrong. Nationwide, Democrat senators collectively earned 18 million more votes than Republicans. We only have a Republican Senate because our system is designed to give less densely populated, more conservative areas a disproportionately high amount of voting power. Add in gerrymandering, voter ID laws, Republicans purging progressive voters, and prison disenfranchisement, and you have a recipe for the conservative minority rule we currently live under. Argument 4. Prisoners would vote to legalize crime.
So say you're a convicted mass rapist. You've raped 20 women. Well, how are you going to cast your vote if you're allowed to vote? It's not going to be for anyone who is promoting the safety of women, is it? So there is a direct consequence, a direct electoral voting consequence in allowing serious offenders to vote.
Here's John R. Lott Jr. in the National Review. With 33% of potential voters easily located in one place, local candidates are going to spend a lot of time campaigning at the prison. Why is it in the interest of women that rapists should have a say in deciding who will win elections? Sexual offenders aren't going to support women's safety and health issues or education the way that other citizens will. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because my response is similar to the previous point. This line of thinking is undemocratic. If you're restricting people's right to vote based on how you think they'll vote, then there isn't really a right to vote. Furthermore, prisoners probably would vote to legalize some things that are illegal, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. When people hear about legalizing crime, they tend to assume we'll be living in a chaotic, purge-like scenario where rape and murder are allowed. As I explained earlier in the video, the vast majority of rapists will never be convicted or lose their right to vote, and rape is still illegal. If every person convicted of murder currently in prison were allowed to vote, then you're looking at about 200,000 people who might be inclined to legalize that crime. I'm not convinced you have to worry about them making murder illegal. There's also the fact that the United States is not a direct democracy where every citizen votes on individual laws. Instead, we are a democratic republic where people elect representatives who choose policies for us. I seriously doubt a pro-rape, pro-murder candidate would be able to garner mainstream appeal. Before I move on, I want to revisit this John Lott Jr. quote from the National Review. With 33% of potential voters easily located in one place, local candidates are going to spend a lot of time campaigning at the prison. This would actually be a good thing. Incarcerated people are far more likely than average to have seen this country at its worst. They're intimately familiar with the ways our country is anti-working class, anti-black, and anti-immigrant. Politicians currently spend a disproportionately large amount of time on the campaign trail with rich white people. Once they do get elected, a lot of their time that should be devoted to legislating and talking to constituents goes to wealthy donors instead, because they need to raise money for their own re-elections and to help other party members at risk of losing their seats in competitive races. Just listen to them say it themselves.
In the 2014 election cycle, candidates for the House and Senate raised a combined $1.7 billion. Interestingly, much of that money has to be raised one way or another by the politicians themselves, which they have complained about for years and say that it can be the worst part of their job.
You know, I hated raising money. Hated it.
It's painful, frankly, to continually ask people for money.
If Don and I could tell you how many hours we spend with our good colleagues on our side of the issues talking about raising money, it would be an embarrassment, because it is an embarrassment.
But the sheer amount of time politicians spend fundraising is not just embarrassing, it's horrifying. Some say the members can spend anywhere from 25 to 50% of their time on it. But former Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle once guessed that in the 2 years before an election, senators can spend 2/3 of their time raising money.
This naturally produces a set of representatives who are more beholden to the interests of wealthy elites than the needs of average voters. Having their attention be redirected toward the country's incarcerated population would do wonders for putting the perspectives of politicians back in alignment with most citizens. Since I've already shown that prisoners are more likely to vote Democrat and thus have progressive values, there are a couple of policies I think they're more likely to change than the ones regarding rape and murder. It's probably not a stretch to think prisoners would be strong allies in fights for decriminalizing drugs, decriminalizing sex work, Medicare for all, universal public housing, free college, and plenty of other leftist causes that would improve their lives as well as everyone else's. Besides, do you really think this guy deserves to have his right to vote taken away because he drank from a whites-only water fountain while black? What about Rosa Parks? What about Martin Luther King? How did we even end up with a system where being in prison means you can't vote? Well, as I've alluded to many times already, the biggest factor would have to be racism. Jeff Monza and Christopher Eugen do a great job of explaining the history of mass incarceration and voting rights in their book Locked Out, Felon Disenfranchisement, and American Democracy. I specifically want to talk about Chapter 2, which has contributions from Angela Behrens. They found plenty of quotes from legislators who explicitly intended on using the judicial system as a means to avoid honoring the rights provided to Black Americans during Reconstruction. Here are two of them. In 1896, the Mississippi Supreme Court considered a challenge to the state's 1890 Constitutional Convention, which had explicitly barred individuals convicted of certain petty offenses from participating in elections. The selected offenses were almost exclusively applied against African Americans, while crimes of which whites were regularly convicted, including rape and even murder, did not affect voting rights. In endorsing this seemingly bizarre duality, the court declared that race affects the type of crime to which one is prone. The Constitutional Convention swept the circle of expedients to obstruct the exercise of the franchise by the Negro race. By reasons of its previous condition of servitude and dependence, this race has acquired or accentuated certain peculiarities of habit, of temperament, and of character which clearly distinguish it as a race from that of the white, a patient, docile people, but careless, landless, and migratory within narrow limits without a forethought, and its criminal members given rather to furtive offenses than to the robust crimes of the whites. More substantial changes were adopted during Alabama's 1901 Constitutional Convention, when the vague phrase, crime involving moral turpitude, was added. Participants at the all-white convention openly sought to establish white supremacy, using suffrage as a key mechanism to achieve the goal. John Fielding Burns, sponsor of the new disenfranchisement bill, boasted that the crime of wife-beating alone would disqualify 60% of the Negroes. Here's the full quote by John B. Knox of Calhoun County from Day 2 of the Alabama Constitutional Convention. One has studied the history of recent events to very little purpose who has failed to discover that race prejudice exists at the North in as pronounced a form as at the South, and that the question of Negro domination, when brought home, will arouse the same opposition in either section. And what is it that we want to do? Why, it is within the limits proposed by the federal Constitution to establish white supremacy in this state. This is our problem, and we should be permitted to deal with it, unobstructed by outside influences, with a sense of our responsibilities as citizens and our duty to posterity. Here's what Eugen, Monza, and Behrens found when they reviewed the timeline of the passage of laws restricting voting rights for prisoners, including a little bit of insight on how white voters continue to be a roadblock on the path towards racial equality. In the past 15 years, the link between racial attitudes and the policy preferences of citizens and elites has become one of the most widely studied topics among analysts of political psychology and public opinion. These studies agree that, to the extent public policies come to be seen as benefiting African Americans, their popularity plummets. Race-neutral social policies, by contrast, tend to retain much higher levels of popular support. While class-based factors were important, felon disenfranchisement laws before the Civil War are not plausibly tied to race, for the simple reason that most states did not permit African Americans to vote at all. Since most free African Americans were already legally disenfranchised, further targeting the black vote through disenfranchising measures directed at felons would have been largely superfluous. The first wave begins in the 1840s in the Northeast, following on the heels of the decline of property and other restrictions on white male suffrage. The second major growth period of disenfranchisement laws occurred after the Civil War. Between 1865 and 1900, 19 states adopted or amended laws restricting the voting rights of criminal offenders. We've repeated our analyses to test the effects of the same independent variables on adoption of a state's first ex-felon disenfranchisement law, the most severe ballot restriction. We again found a positive and significant effect of the non-white prison population. The non-white population, the non-white male population, and the non-white prison population are all significant positive predictors of passing felon disenfranchisement law after 1870. When African Americans make up a larger portion of the state's prison population, that state is significantly more likely to adopt or extend felon disenfranchisement. Modern defenders of the practice certainly draw upon non-racial reasons for their position, and we do not intend by this analysis to imply anything to the contrary. This does not, however, mean that there is no connection between race and felon disenfranchisement. Indeed, when we ask the question of how we got to the point where American practice can be so out of line with the rest of the democratic world, the most plausible answer we can supply is that of race. Okay, so by now I've spent a lot of time explaining what's wrong with our current system. What then should we do to become more democratic? First, we should obviously join Canada, Croatia, the Czech Republic, plus over a dozen other countries and allow incarcerated people to vote while they're still in prison. We should also get rid of voter registration laws and let everyone vote as soon as they turn 18. Election day should be a federal holiday. Every state should allow people to vote early without requiring them to provide a reason. Disabled people in every state should be allowed to have an election official visit their home so they can cast their vote in person. Abolish the Electoral College and the Senate. This is by no means an exhaustive list, and I encourage you to come up with your own creative improvements. Basically, we need to start treating voting rights as positive rights rather than negative ones. In their article, There Is No Right to Vote, Vanessa A.B. and Oren Nimni explain the difference and how important it is to ensure equal rights. Every explicit reference to the right to vote describes it as a negative right. Negative rights, as contrasted with positive rights, are a promise not to impose certain things on us, be they constraints, interferences, or the freedom from oppressive practices. The 15th Amendment states that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The 19th Amendment says the same, but substitutes sex in place of race. The 24th Amendment substitutes the failure to pay poll tax or any other tax. And the 26th Amendment substitutes any age restriction other than 18 years old. It's not so much that we're entitled to vote, the Constitution tells us. Rather, we are guaranteed freedom from some voting interference on the basis of some reasons. Because the right to vote is not a positive right, nothing in the law compels states to use their power to maximize the odds that individuals will deploy their right to vote. They are merely disallowed from certain specific kinds of infringements. The government can effectively restrict voting rights access for any reason other than the few enumerated prohibitions, and the right still has not been violated in any legal sense. Voting rights are a lot like abortion rights in this sense. Legally, anyone can get an abortion, but thanks to various smaller restrictions, the feasibility of actually doing so varies drastically by which part of the country you live and how much money you have. I want to end this video by asking viewers to start thinking hard about the social construction of crime. I know it may be hard to believe because it contradicts a lot of what we've been told, but prisons in the United States are not making us safer. Punishment doesn't work. YouTuber People's Bayonet has a great video on this. I don't have time to go into the details of it here, but prison abolition really is the path toward making sure everyone in society is treated fairly. We waste tons of resources on locking people up instead of devoting them to solving the social problems that lead people to commit crimes in the first place. I'll quote longtime prison abolitionist Angela Davis. She puts it really well in this passage from her book, Abolition Democracy. The grand achievement of civil rights was to purge the law of its references to specific kinds of bodies, thus enabling racial equality before the law. But at the same time, this process enabled racial inequality in the sense that the law was deprived of its capacity to acknowledge people as being racialized, as coming from racialized communities. Because the person that stands before the law is an abstract, rights-bearing subject, the law is unable to apprehend the unjust social realities in which many people live. To give a more concrete example, one that relates to the formation of the prison industrial complex, I would say that precisely because the law is unable to take into consideration those social conditions that render certain communities much more susceptible to imprisonment than others, the mechanism of formal due process justifies the racist and class character of prison populations. The law does not care whether this individual had access to good education or not, or whether he or she lives under impoverished conditions because companies in his or her community have shut down and moved to a third world country, or whether previously available welfare payments have vanished. The law does not care about the condition that leads some communities along a trajectory that makes prison inevitable. Even though each individual has the right to due process, what is called the blindness of justice enables underlying racism and class bias to resolve the question of who gets to go to prison and who does not. Finally, those of us who have never been to prison have to stop viewing ourselves as superior to those who have been imprisoned. Distinguishing ourselves this way is the first step toward the dehumanization that enables the abuse and social death of prisoners all across the country. Michelle Alexander, author of The New Jim Crow, explains this eloquently.
What must we do to build this movement that has been living in the hearts and souls of our people for so long? That's a question I'm often asked. Well, first, we've got to start telling the truth, the whole truth. It's an unpopular truth. It's America's most inconvenient truth, but is the truth nonetheless. We've got to be willing to break the silence. We've got to admit out loud that we as a nation have managed to rebirth a caste system in America. And we've got to start admitting our own criminality out loud so that those who are returning home from prison are not so isolated and stigmatized. Truth is, we're all criminals, all of us. If you're an adult, you've broken the law at some point in your lives. You drank underage. You drank underage. You may have experimented with drugs, illegal drugs. Or, I often say if the worst thing you've ever done in your unadventurous life is speed 10 miles over the speed limit on the freeway, you've put yourself and others at more risk of harm than someone smoking marijuana in the privacy of their living room. So we've got to start ending this us versus them. That we're going to help those criminals who aren't us. All of us are sinners. All of us have made mistakes. All of us are criminals. And question is, are we willing to still love one another despite our failings and our mistakes? Now, I want to be clear. I want to be clear that when I'm talking about love, I'm not talking just about love for those people who have committed crimes like we may have committed. I'm not talking about caring about or loving people who have committed crimes that we think not so bad. I'm talking about the kind of care and love that keeps on loving no matter who you are or what you have done. It's that kind of love that is needed to build this movement.
Thanks for watching. I appreciate the positive feedback from my last video on police disarmament. I've decided to keep making videos since I've learned educating others is just as important as real-world organizing. If you're a leftist and are able to get involved locally, I strongly recommend doing it. I'm personally still learning to balance YouTube with all of my responsibilities outside of the internet. I have a lot planned for this channel, but realistically I don't expect to be able to produce more than 2 to 3 videos per year. If you want to keep up with what I'm doing and support me, then subscribe, leave a comment, and like the video. All of it helps promote my work to more people in YouTube's algorithm. You can also find me on Twitter. That's enough self-promo. So long, and keep moving left.